All right. The being who can govern itself has nothing to fear in life. This is Mary Wollstonecraft's challenge, her daring vision for women's liberation in a vindication of the rights of women. The idea that women can, through proper education and commitment to reason, and everything that Tim just talked about in Kant's idea of enlightenment, can achieve the same freedom of thought and rationality as man, that there is no difference. Writing in the late 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, Wollstonecraft challenged her fellow thinkers to extend their ambitious beliefs in humanity's potential beyond the confines of their own sex. There was a glaring blind spot in the heated discussions about the rights of man, freedom of conscience, equality of opportunity, and that blind spot was woman-sized. So briefly, who was Mary Wollstonecraft? She was born into a relatively wealthy upbringing in 1759, but relatively wealthy family. She had something of a mixed upbringing because she had, as wasn't uncommon at the time, a relatively feckless father who turned into a drunk and a brute and squandered the family inheritance. So she had this sort of interesting exposure to both the upper echelons of society and also experience of the injustices which they could create. Something that really shaped her political outview from an early stage was the knowledge of the fact that her brother was going to inherit what little was left after her father's drinking, and not her, despite her and her sisters doing the lion's share of the work of family life. She was educated. She set up a school with her sisters and later took a job in Ireland as a governess, which was a relatively miserable period in her life, but allowed her to have the space to start to think about some of the things she's writing in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she begins with a short work, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters in Ireland. But it was really back in Newington Green, when she returned to London, North London, where her political education and engagement started to take shape and really become exciting. She was attending dinner parties there with the likes of the revolutionary Thomas Paine, author of The Rights of Man and Age of Reason, and exposed to the kind of, and fully participant in the kind of electric discussions about the French Revolution and the potential for man to shape his own destiny. And she found a lot of this full of potential, but wanting. And it was one of her sort of most famous early works was a retaliation to the philosopher Edmund Burke's critique of the goings-on in France in a pro-Republican pamphlet, A Vindication of the Rights of Men. So she sort of had made her name. She was part of this really interesting set of thinkers, and she was known as a somewhat radical voice in British political circles. And so then, possibly sick of being underestimated at dinner tables by the men she was having these intellectual battles with, and certainly inspired by a misrepresentation of women's capabilities and ambitions in the works of writers that she really admired, like Rousseau, Wollstonecraft wrote her most famous work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in 1792, and it was at the time received well. There was no uproar, despite it being really quite radical in places. It was only until later, in fact after her death, that some pushback came to the fore. She was really adventurous for a woman at the time. She went to Paris following the publication of her book. She was very, very close to what was going on in the revolution. She talked about seeing some of the central figures of the revolution pass by her bedroom window, and she was trying to write an early history, actually, of the first beginnings of the revolution, which was a very dangerous task, something which had led to people being in line for the guillotine. And it's in Paris where she, following the sort of disheartenment of the beginning of the Reign of Terror and the sort of increasingly gory days of the revolution, met and had her first daughter Fanny with a man called Gilbert Imlay, who was, by all accounts, as she describes, a rake, and eventually ditched her. And this then was preceded by a hard time of heartbreak to suicide attempts and eventually a recovery in Sweden, where she starts to write some very interesting work. And Fanny and Mary return home back in London, where she's reunited with William Godwin, who she met at those dinner parties of the past. They form a relationship of equals. They live separately, but they're married. They're very much intellectual sparring partners, and it's a very kind of productive time in her life. She continues to write fiction and political work, but tragically, this is where her story abruptly ends. Days after giving birth to her second daughter, Mary, she dies. We know Mary as the author of Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. So, Wollstonecraft is this remarkable, remarkable woman at a time when women are expected, demanded to be invisible. And her book, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, is at times actually an incredibly angry protests at these kind of injustices faced by her fellow women. She says, is one half of the human species, like the poor African slaves, to be subject to prejudices that brutalise them, when principles would be a sure regard only to sweeten the cup of man? And she really goes to town on Rousseau in the book, even though she has massive admiration for him. It's that admiration that makes her so angry at his depiction of women. She talks about his work, Emile, in which he depicts women as defined by their relationship to men, ornamental, pretty, pleasing, pliant. And she rebuts with great quotes like this: "What nonsense! When will a great man arise with sufficient strength of mind to puff away the fumes which pride and sensuality have thus spread over the subject?" And her argument is quite simply this, that knowledge, education and reason, those great Enlightenment beliefs, have been kept from women purposefully and hoarded by men. And as such, women have become infantile, superficial, weak. And rather than see this injustice that they have created, men point out these weaknesses as proof of women's ineligibility for the same freedoms and equalities as they enjoy. And by the way, this isn't sort of by any stretch of the imagination, an anti-man text. She is equally as annoyed at women of her class and above who go along with such pretenses. In fact, she's really quite bitchy in places, which is something that's very enjoyable to read. She says, the conversations of French women, who are not so rigidly nailed to their chairs to twist lappets and not ribands, is frequently superficial, I give you, but I contend that it's not half so insipid as that of those English women whose time is spent in making caps, bonnets, and the whole mischief of trimmings, not to mention shopping. So she's really angry at the fact that women's experience and contribution to the world is so narrowly defined. But, and this is a really crucial point, she recognises how the odds are stacked against women. That in this world in which men are afforded the unending scope of imagination that education and knowledge gives them, women have two choices: to become the frilly Madonna who makes good marriage choices to better herself, a phrase which Wollstonecraft spits at in the text, the idea of bettering yourself. Either they can do that or they can become the whore. And actually, rather bitterly, she notes that necessity never makes prostitution the business of men's lives. So she's very clear about the injustices and inequalities that women face and why they face them. So we can imagine why a Vindication was revolutionary in the late 1700s, challenging women to become independent thinkers and men to take them seriously. And the book doesn't explicitly go into any details about, for example, arguments for votes. It does a little bit of a few paragraphs on the idea of jobs, but there's no focus on practical rights for women. It's much more a general conversation about women's capabilities and women's freedom, but it does get used latterly after the suffragettes hold up banners with Wollstonecraft's name. She is very impactful in future arguments for women's kind of practical rights. So then why is she relevant today? Why are we not just seeing Wollstonecraft as an interesting female thinker at a time when they were few and far between? Today, women are legally afforded almost, not quite, all the same freedoms as men. Discrimination is both socially frowned upon and legally impermissible. And most people who are polled or asked around the time of elections or otherwise what they think about gender equality in men and women, that they mostly agree that we should be allowed to do the same thing. So, rosy picture in general, yeah, life is good for women. Why then is Mary Wollstonecraft important? Because I want you to think about the central tenet of her work, which is this: that women's inequality stems from a notion that we are naturally weaker, naturally more fragile, and therefore naturally in need of greater protection than men, that there is some kind of baseline of something natural that explains our inequality. She doesn't deny, let's just be clear, the kind of reality of nature. She says, I will allow that the bodily strength seems to give man a natural superiority over women, and this is the only solid basis on which the superiority of the sex can be built. So she's clear, men are stronger generally, physically. But I still insist, she says, that not only the virtue but the knowledge of the two sexes should be the same in nature, if not in degree, and that women, considered not only as immoral but rational creatures, ought to endeavour to acquire human virtues of perfection by the same means as men, instead of being educated like a fanciful kind of half-being. So she's really making a distinction there, saying, we know that you might be able to run faster, jump higher and hit harder, but that is a separate conversation from our worth as political, social, philosophical beings. She says at one point, for only by the jostling of equality can we form a just opinion of ourselves. She says that men are being degraded by the lack of female self-actualization as well as women. So she's not even in this book just talking about the negative effects of inequality on women. She's also saying that this is a barrier to men too, that you can't really truly realise a sense of freedom, autonomy, without understanding the limits that you're putting on the human race. So this view that women are, that I think is still expressed quite clearly today, that women are inherently weaker. You know, we have these kind of arguments in contemporary society, nicer in politics, more caring, better at watching the baby, more in need of time off at work for whatever reason, requiring protective policies against nasty language. All of this, which we can find numerous examples of in 2024, stems from the same visceral sexism that Wollstonecraft turned her pen against all those years ago. And, you know, despite the fact that we're all here in a beautiful room like this, young men and women sat next to each other, equally engaged in the intellectual pursuits of rigour and freedom and trying to understand living freedom, the view that women are different and are in need of special treatment, different treatment, still does prevail. In many ways, we are still defined as women as by our relationship to men, in need of protection because men are harmful, in need of leg-ups because men are more forceful, more in touch with our emotions, for example, to counteract the brutality of men. And a vindication of the rights of women is a championing of female agency, of independence from women's characters being shaped and defined in relation to the other sex. And I'll just finish here, Alistair. She says, it is time to effect a revolution in female manners. And we'll go into this in the seminar. She's not talking about table manners, she's talking about something quite profound. Time to restore to them their lost dignity and make them, as a part of the human species, labour by reforming themselves to reform the world. So she doesn't just want women to be free and we all to sit at these dinner parties and have a great time. There is a revolutionary drive behind the idea of a vindication of the rights of women, that by enlightening women, you change the world. It's a really exciting concept. Free women will make free men, will make a free society. She says, I think the female world oppressed, yet the gangrene which the vices engendered by oppression have produced is not confined to the morbid part only, but pervades society at large, so that when I wish to see my sex become more like moral agents, my heart bounds with the anticipation of the general diffusion of that sublime contentment which only morality can diffuse. It's really wonderful parts of her work as kind of half poetic. Wollstonecraft's vision of freedom, I challenge you to think about, has never actually fully been realised. The traps of gilded cages that she experienced 230 years ago have not been smashed, but merely rebranded as safe spaces. And actually many men today who purport to be defenders of freedom still cling on to the idea that women and men are not just physically different, but politically, socially and philosophically, still denying us the freedom they seek to celebrate for themselves. So, yeah, might be a little bit boring. Sorry to join me in that room over there. Looking back at 231 years ago to see why this blazing and tragic story of Mary Wollstonecraft matters for our understanding not just of women's freedom in the 21st century, but of liberty itself.